Welcome to all of you who have decided to join me, Amanda Williams, Sharon Foreman and Carolyn Ewing for a festive show and tell. We're all archivists here at the Record Office, but we are doing our bit where COVID is concerned, so there is only the three of us in the office and we are all socially distancing. Obviously, this has been necessitated by COVID because we can't do this in person, but we hope by doing this, it allows you a little bit of an insight into some of the documents here at the Record Office. Bear with us, this is wholly new, so from a technical side of view and from giving a talk side of view, we're going to do our best. I'm going to talk to you, so I've got the easy bit as Carolyn operates the camera and Sharon is going to post up the 12 images of the documents on show for you today. So the whole point of this talk is to give you an overview of some of the documents that relate to Christmas that are part of the collections held here at Warwickshire County Record Office. And some of those documents will allow me to talk to you a little bit about traditions of England and Warwickshire, and some of the documents relate to sort of the intimate moments of families, for instance, and organisations in Warwickshire. I'd love to tell you that we have documents that relate to every 12 days of Christmas being the song, but I think I would struggle with partridges, leaping lords and pipers and drummers. So this is live. Feel free to ask questions. There is a way of doing so. Sharon is going to put up an image on the screen so that you can see how you can ask questions. I do warn you, I'm not a historian, I'm an archivist, so I might not be able to answer your questions straight away. If I can't answer them, then what we'll try and do is get back to you at some point in the future. But we'll also put up an email address for you at the end of the show and tell, so that if you have a question, you can either email it to our inquiry inbox, or you might want to go on the Our Warwickshire website, a fantastic website full of lots of information about Warwickshire's past down the years. You can read some articles, and if you want to comment about experiences that you may have had, you can do that. And if you want to write an article, even better, you can also write your own article. So this talk really came about because I was wandering through some recipe books for another talk that I was doing, and I was convinced that I'd come across something called a 12th night cake. And when I decided that I would do a talk about Christmas, I thought I'm going to end it with the 12th night cake recipe. And so I went back to all the recipe books that we hold in the Record Office, and could I find the 12th night cake? I couldn't. Now, I've either made this up, at the time that's what I thought, or I just still haven't been able to find it. However, when I started to look into 12th night cakes, thinking I may well have dreamt the whole thing up, I did come across a really good website which the English Heritage have put up about 12th night cakes. So they do exist. I didn't make it up. So the whole talk has been sort of formed around 12th night cakes, 12 days of Christmas, but then with other aspects of Christmas involved. So let's start with document number 1 as I move around the corner. So 12th night, before we actually get stuck into the cake, it's useful to remember that, Christmas really came about as a way of attempting to obliterate the pagan festival that went before, specifically the Roman festival of Saturnalia, which was around the 17th of December, but was moved slightly around to the 21st, which is midwinter. And obviously Christian leaders realised they were going to have a real fight on their hands if they attempted to get rid of all these wonderful customs that had gone previously. So very cleverly, as we all know, they kind of pinned Christmas to a lot of what had gone before. And I think as we go through some of the things I'm going to talk to you today about, you're going to see that actually we continued to do some of the things that go way, way back into ancient times. If I tell you that for the Romans, Saturnalia, they would visit the temple, they would party and they would exchange gifts, and the usual order was overturned with masters serving slaves. You can see why, as I say, some of the traditions of our Christmas festivals have a very much a similar sort of sentiment around them. So before the 12 days of Christmas, let's go back to our Christmas time. Before the 12 days of Christmas was Advent. Now, we don't really think much of Advent other than a candle may be lit in church and that we will attend certain services, and it's the run-up for the main event. However, in the past, from the medieval period, probably up until, well, certainly I would imagine up until the Reformation, Advent was a time of penitence and fasting, and so people would fast up until Christmas Day, when we would have the great feast. Now, 12 days of Christmas. When I talk about 12 days of Christmas, it is the song that comes into our head. But if I just mention to you that the song really is a more modern day, I say modern, actually that's modern to me as an archivist who deals with records all the way back. It's sort of an 18th century invention. Possibly it's to do with a game, a memory game that was played, so that people had to recount each day sort of the collie birds, etc., and what the swans are swimming. So that wasn't actually set down as a song either until 1909. So that's quite interesting in itself. We're not talking about the song, the 12 Days of Christmas. We're talking about the actual festival, the 12 Days of Christmas, the beginning from the 25th of December up until 12th night. It was a massive event. An event where people were expected to stop working, a time of feasting, of enjoying yourself, certainly up until the Puritans, and we'll talk about the Puritans a little later. If I think about the 12 days of Christmas, I can't name very many. Obviously the birth of Christ on the 25th, and we still celebrate St. Stephen's Day as Boxing Day in my house, where we have a big slap-up meal, and if we all remember the tune, Good King Wenceslas last looked out, and he gives money to the poor, that's what would have happened down the ages. Money was doled out to the poor on Boxing Day, and actually also feasting might be given to your tenants on Boxing Day, and Boxing Day is a modern term, it would have been called St. Stephen's Day. Then I kind of lose track about what feast days were involved, and if you go back to the medieval calendar, they sort of add saints' days in. So for instance, you get Thomas Becket's Day added into the 12 days of Christmas, and the Feast of the Holy Innocents, which plays quite a good part actually, and I'll come back to that a little later on in this talk. The 12 days of Christmas did not include New Year's Day as we think of it, because New Year didn't start on the 1st of January in this country until 1752, and at that point they removed 11 days. Apparently there was supposed to be a little bit of riotous behaviour, but I've also been told that that's a myth, that people didn't riot because they were losing their 11 days. So they started the calendar from the 25th of March, which was where it had been originally, which was called Lady Day. They begin it on the 1st of January. However, if you think about it, there is still a new year of a type that occurs in our years, and that's the financial year. Now, the financial year would also have been the 25th of March, but that changes because rather than taking it back to the 1st of January and losing 11 days of taxation, what they do is they begin the financial year on the 5th of January, 5th of April. Another day is given over when they realise that they've got a problem with leap years, so it becomes the 6th of April, and that's where our financial year comes from. It's not nearly so much fun as the 1st of January. It's also not quite as simple as being the 1st of January, because actually you will see occasionally New Year being referred to in the Christmas festival, and I'll come again to that a little later. I'll leave you to mull on that one for a little while. So the 12 days of Christmas would culminate with 12th night. This would be a night, probably the night they most looked forward to over every single other festival day. So they would come together with a great cake, and this is where our first document comes in. This is a cake, a most excellent cake. I mentioned earlier that I couldn't find a 12th night cake that I still think exists somewhere, but I haven't been able to find it so far. So what we have is in the Wise Family Recipe book of the 18th century, a most excellent cake. Now, I don't know if any of you managed to watch the Lucy Worsley programme the other day, but she showed a great cake, a most excellent cake, when she was doing her programme about 12th night. A huge cake, and something I've never seen before. And I think that this most likely would have been used as the 12th night cake, because it also is iced. This one has marzipan and icing, and it shows you how to make the icing. What's interesting about the cake is that they would have placed a bean in the cake and a pea. A bean for the Lord of the cake, and actually it would be the Lord of Misrule, and a pea for the Queen of the Pea. Now, the Lord of Misrule would oversee the proceedings, you know, social order perhaps turned on its head a little, going back to that idea of Saturnalia and the Roman servants being the ones being served by their lords. So very interesting, and something the Tudors particularly enjoyed doing. As time evolved, we would lose the bean and the pea, and they would be replaced by little trinkets. And if you think about it, we now, most of us no longer have a 12th night cake, and what we do is some people still put trinkets into the Christmas pudding. I also think the cake does exist in a sort of format, in that we have Christmas cake, and I think the Christmas cake really took over from the 12th night cake. 18th century 12th night cakes are absolutely beautiful to behold if you ever see images of them. Incidentally, the cake in the medieval and Tudor period would probably be more like a brioche or a panettone. It's only with later cooking inventions and evolutions that they realised that eggs can be used as a raising agent, and it becomes more like our Christmas cake today. So that's a little bit about 12th night. What I should also say about 12th night and 12th night cake is that with Protestantism, it starts to fade out and it becomes more of a secular occasion, as opposed to a one of religion and spirituality, as well as all the human feasting, etc. So then I want to move on to our second document, which is Christmas carols. Carol, from the French word to dance, because they think that a carol would have originally been something that was sung, but as people danced in a circle. Now, you can imagine for the church that this has very major pagan overtones, so they don't particularly like it. So the church doesn't really like carols. It likes Christmas music. That's different. Christmas music going back to the 4th century AD in Rome, and it's also sort of evolved through people like Bernard of Clairvaux, but carols are very different. However, they are sung, and carols continually are sung as an aspect of processions. So the medieval people were very keen on their feasts and festivals and their processions, and carols would be sung alongside all those processions, but not just at Christmas. It would be at the major feasts like Easter and maybe even harvest. So carols are being sung at that point in time, but they're also being sung at something called a mystery play. And one of the most famous ones that survives from the very late medieval period is the Coventry Carol, which I think a lot of us know about even now. Its content isn't particularly what we would call festive, but it does involve those 12 days of Christmas, because it's concerned with the slaughtering of the innocents by King Herod at Christmas time. And actually, it's one of my favourites, I have to say that as well. The first English carols, as we think of them, were sung in the vernacular and not Latin. They're very much the songs of the people as opposed to the church. If you think church, probably would have thought, you know, your songs in church possibly would have been more Latin in speech. And they're first written down, some of the early ones are written down in 1426 by a Shropshire cleric called John Audley. But actually the first printed carol book, I think, is the 16th century. They were probably sung by wassailers, so they would go out and sing to each household, and in order for them to sing you a decent song, they would expect something in return, so maybe some food, cheese particularly. Again, the church cracks down on wassailers because it all gets a little bit rowdy with the beer and the drinking and whatever else happens when they're going out wassailing. So it is cracked down on a little bit, but they can't get rid of it. And even when the Puritans are cracking down on Christmas in the 1640s, they still don't get rid of carols. And I'm not sure their intention ever was to ban a carol. Certainly they don't want carols in church. So they're communal songs. They would also have been sung down the pub, so probably another reason why the church weren't particularly keen. And some of them were thought to have lyrics that were a bit questionable, a little bit too rude for the church. I think Whilst Shepherds Watch Their Flocks by Night was one of those. So don't think that the Puritans banned them, but they weren't allowed to be sung in church. I think they quite like them being sung outside of church, in homes particularly. Although one of the earliest, well, the earliest Protestant person, Martin Luther, was said to like a carol. In the 19th century, again, the church begins to crack down upon carols. I think partly because a church band would play in church, but they would also play outside of church and in the local pub. So I think that crossover the church wasn't very comfortable with. And also, you know, a lot of clerics during the 19th century, they come from a university college background, and they're used to hearing those choirs in sort of very serene places, and they are looking to have more of that within their churches. So we sort of lose the Christmas carol, the traditional, old traditional Christmas carols that also have a very regional flavour. But fortunately for us, two people, William Sandys and David Gilbert, in the 1830s set out to collect some of those old village carols, and that's what they do. And they create a little printed book. Now that helps to save some of those carols that are disappearing, because we've sort of got involved with other carols as well. People have started to write carols such as Once in Royal David City that become very popular in church. We like our Victorian carols, and even now I have to say it's the Victorian carols that mostly we will sing. However, in 1871 another little book was published, and this was by, if I remember the name, Henry Ramsden and Sir John Stainer. So in 1871 this was published, and we've got a little book. We've got the exact copy in the record office as part of the Townsend Family of Newnham collection, and this also contains Christmas carols old and new. And I note that on here we've got God Rest You Merry Gentlemen. That's probably the only one that I know, but I do know that there were regional variations with the tune and potentially, I suspect, with the words for God Rest You Merry Gentlemen. So let's move on from Christmas carols, because that's quite a lot to take in, and move on to one of my favourite subjects, and that's the mince pie. So the mince pie, we've got a strange little book here which tells us about the origins of mince pies. The book dates to post-1830s and was written by Evelyn Shirley. And it seems to me that this is a little book that would have been kept in a pocket, and that that Evelyn Shirley would have wandered around and visited, and when snippets of information were given or came to him, or he found out about them, it seems to me that they were jotted down, because you'll see that this is written in pencil. And I'll read to you what it says, because you might not be able to see it on the screen. It says, mince pies at Christmas were originally made of spices to commemorate the wise men bringing frankincense, etc. Their shape was the coffin form to be like the manger in which the infant Jesus lay. So they are thought to be medieval in origin. However, they weren't thought to be just eaten at Christmas. They were a luxury good, so it's expensive to buy and probably would have been eaten at Christmas and Easter. However, I suspect that the fact that they were in a coffin-shaped pastry case would lead most people to begin to associate the mince pie with Christmas. That's helped with the fact that they also used to put a dough baby Jesus on the top of the mince pie, which the Puritans didn't like. So when the Puritans come along, they get rid of the baby dough Jesus, which they see as idolatrous, and actually the mince pie takes on its more rounded shape. Very early days, the pastry was said to be totally inedible, but if the poor did manage to get hold of one of these pies, they would have eaten that pastry case as well. So you were just eating the mincemeat. Mincemeat, well, they were also called shredded pies, and that's because, or shred pies, that's because suet and meat was shredded alongside the raisins. There would be breadcrumbs and wine, and all of that would be put into the case. Rich would only eat the mincemeat itself, but that's why it's called mincemeat or shred pies, as they were sometimes known. The taste, that particular taste, wasn't, I mean, for us it's a pudding, it's a sweet, but back then it probably would have been seen as just as much a savoury pie as a pork pie probably was. That type of taste and seasoning we often find in our recipe books for savoury recipes going back to the 18th century. It's very much a taste that they like. So, as I say, the pie itself, again, wasn't banned by Oliver Cromwell. It gets a really bad rap when it comes to Christmas, but they would have frowned upon the use of the baby dough Jesus. What I find interesting nowadays is if you look at our mince pies over the last few years, we've started to put stars on the top, and I do wonder how that would have gone down for the Puritan. So, if you want a recipe, I suspect, is there a mince pie recipe on our Warwickshire?
Oh, yes.
So there's a mince pie recipe on our Warwickshire if you want to have a go with meat. And incidentally, I don't think that the meat mince pie has totally disappeared. I've been told that it still exists in some areas of the country. So let's move on to our next document, which is all about the greenery, the holly in this instance. Now this is quite an odd document to choose for a Christmas document. It's actually one of our quarter session minute books, the quarter sessions being the administrators of the county of Warwickshire, as they were then, but also they dealt with matters of crime. Major crime was dealt with at the assize, but for the quarter sessions they would deal with the lesser crimes, not the totally petty crimes, but the lesser crimes. And on this occasion, we're talking about the Epiphany Sessions, which were heard in January of 1898. And we can see that on an indictment we have two gentlemen, if I can find their names, which I can't, William Lacey and William Warner, who were indicted for stealing holly. Now, if they were stealing holly, that says to me that they're either selling it for somebody to decorate their house, or they're stealing it so that they can decorate their own houses. Holly and ivy we still think of as being associated totally with Christmas even now, but we don't particularly decorate our houses overly much with the holly and the ivy. But it has strong associations with Christianity, we know that. Holly, the crown and the blood of Jesus. Ivy is associated with sort of Christmas imagery, really, but it does have some representation. But holly, ivy, mistletoe, all of those things that we think of as Christmas greenery go way back into pagan times. So we know that Druids used holly for their winter rituals. We know that mistletoe has quite a large place in Nordic traditions, and I won't go into those now, but if you're interested, it's well worth having a read of that, because it is really, really interesting. Holly was said to represent the crown of thorns, as I mentioned. ivy representing dependence and endurance and faithfulness. And another thing that we possibly don't realise that was used often, particularly by Tudors, was rosemary. Rosemary was said to have connections with the Virgin Mary, possibly because of the little blue flower that you get on rosemary. And I was looking at rosemary in my garden the other day, and I think it's about to flower. So I wonder whether it's also to do with the fact that it flowers in the winter. I also think that if you're living in a medieval or Tudor house and you bring some rosemary in, it creates a lovely smell, which possibly overpowers other smells that might be existing in your accommodation. Rosemary also has associations with remembrance, particularly with the dead and of love. And if we go on then to mistletoe, now mistletoe was frowned on by the church, and I think probably because of its links to those pagan traditions. So mistletoe was not something that the church wanted within the church walls, but mistletoe survived despite that. We still use mistletoe, we still like to put mistletoe up, and we still like a kiss underneath it. And I suspect that that also might be why the church didn't particularly like it, because it perhaps, you know, encouraged licentious behaviour. What the Tudors would do is they would put mistletoe, ivy, holly, bay and rosemary into a bough and bring that into the house, and that would be called a kissing bough. And yes, the Tudor people would kiss underneath the bough. Kenilworth Castle, actually, I am told, still take a kissing bough into the castle at Christmas time, and I wonder whether that's to signify Dudley and Elizabeth's supposed relations. So decorating the house was a must for medieval households, Tudor households, and probably continued to be a must right up until, I suppose, maybe the Christmas tree replaced it, or maybe even again we've got the Puritans to thank for the fact that perhaps we didn't do that, because maybe, in fact, I know for a fact that they didn't like the greenery to be within the church, but some churches rebelled against that and did still continue to put that greenery up in church at Christmas time. So I have to also add, I shouldn't tell you this, but my father still goes out finding holly, I don't know where from, and I get a little sprig of holly which gets put in a bucket outside the house until Christmas Eve, when I'm then allowed by my father to take the holly into the house and put on the mantelpiece, and it stays there until the 6th of January when it's removed. So there you go, a little bit of holly tradition that continues. So let's move on to one of the things that I love talking about best, even though it's the strangest, and that's the Christmas turkey. So our letter tells of a Yarmouth coach which is going to be at London on the Tuesday and brings with it a turkey, and the letter is dated December the 22nd, so we know the turkey is for Christmas. Now, the letter is dated 1750, and I think if most of us think about turkeys, we think turkeys became the Christmas staple from the 1950s onwards, but actually, yes and no. We know that King Henry VIII had a turkey at Christmas in 1520, and I suspect that that's because large birds were a status symbol. They show power and wealth, and so, you know, people that are high status, they want a large bird. And apparently turkey, I've never eaten peacock or swan, but apparently it's supposed to taste better than both of those. Peacock apparently is said to be a bit stringy, so turkey would be preferable, I would suspect, to the peacock. However, I suspect it possibly didn't replace over the birds, but was sat amongst them, because turkey wasn't the main part of the Christmas feast, it was a part of the Christmas feast. You would have all sorts of meats being prepared and brought to the table, and that might include venison. Most certainly, I think venison may well have been seen as the meat to have, but again, going back to the Lucy Worsley programme, I noticed that one of the things that they liked to bring in was the boar's head, and there's a fantastic carol about the boar's head, and I would, you know, advise anybody to go and look at that on YouTube, because it's really good fun. Both Walter Raleigh and Francis Drake claim to bring back the turkey from their travels, but we know that the Spanish had sort of reached the Americas, and most certainly they were bringing turkeys back. I suspect, although I don't know, maybe turkeys became a bit more popular when in the 17th century we'd started to colonize America, because turkeys would have been around in America at that point. I don't know, it's a thought, but we do know that they were rearing turkeys quite early on in East Anglia, Norfolk, and actually we know that they're rearing them, they are dipping their feet in tar, and they are walking the turkeys from East Anglia over to London. So that's quite interesting, and I also find it interesting because in our document our turkey gets to come to London in a coach. We do really have Charles Dickens to thank for the turkey becoming the thing that we aspire to, particularly the middle classes, I would say, and that's because if you remember A Christmas Carol, which I remember sort of really well because I watch a Muppet Christmas Carol every year, the reformed Scrooge leans out of the window and he sees a little boy standing in the street, and he says to the little boy, "Go and get me the turkey, not the prize turkey, but the biggest prize turkey." And that is the bird he's going to give to Bob Cratchit. It's the thing to aspire to. It's the most expensive. We know that people would have eaten goose traditionally. They may well have eaten rabbit as well as chicken. It would depend on what you could afford. And we know from A Christmas Carol that the poor Bob Cratchit has a goose at Christmas, and actually I think it says somewhere that he has to save up through the year to purchase that goose, and there were goose clubs in which you would do that. But as I say, the middle classes would aspire, particularly because of what Charles Dickens is saying, to the turkey. We also know from Mrs. Beeton that at Christmas time, and this is where we begin to really associate Christmas and turkey, Mrs. Beeton says that only at Christmas time does the turkey shoot up in price. So that tells you that there is a demand. There is a practical reason for not having turkey, and there's a practical reason for having turkey. If you are feeding a huge amount of people, you are going to want a large bird. However, if you don't have an oven large enough to roast your bird, it's going to be very tricky for you to have a turkey. That said, and again, anecdotally, I know this to be true, you could buy a turkey and you could have it roasted at the nearby inn or baker's. And my great grandmother, most certainly, with a large family, she took a turkey every Christmas to the local baker's and had it roasted at the baker's. So that's definitely true. Apparently on such days as those, there would be processions of people walking back and forward from the inn or the baker's with their turkey. So let's move on to Christmas cards. Christmas cards, sort of, they come about, they're a merchandising idea really by Henry Cole, who was a senior civil servant, and he was the assistant keeper at the post office. And what he wants to do is sort of market the post office. So along with a friend, and if I can find out, yes, his friend John Horsley, who was an artist, they come up with the Christmas card. And I don't know, Sharon, showing you the Christmas card that we have as part of the Towns and Families collection. Again, it's a 19th century card. Early cards would feature the nativity, but you can also see from the card that we're hopefully showing you that there's not a lot that's Christmassy about the card that we have. It's just a very nicely decorated little card, but they do evolve. They are invented in sort of 1843. They start to become popular about the 1860s, but they're probably out of the reach of the majority of people because of the price. The price actually drops to half a penny in the 1870s, and that's when it really takes off. So these Christmas cards really take off at that point in time. As I say, they feature nativity scenes. Robins become very popular in the late Victorian times, and if anybody watched QI the other night, they would have seen a dead robin featured on the Christmas card, which was a bit bizarre, flat on its back. They like snow scenes, And then in the 1910s and the 1920s, cards developed further. They changed their shape, they start to put ribbon and foil on them, and that kind of is something that we still see today. We seem to still like a square Christmas card, but we get all sorts of shapes and sizes. We get glitter, we get ribbons. So that's a little bit about the Christmas card. So moving on, Christmas isn't Christmas without the Christmas pudding, and our document shows you what's called a common plum pudding. Now I have to say plum, I think means raisin. I think they use the term plum for raisin, so that's why it's called a plum pudding. And what we have here, I've had a quick look at this recipe. It's a bit odd to me. Yes, it's got the carrots that I would expect, but it's also got potato in it. It's got currants, it's got raisins, it's got flour, it's got bread that's been grated, and it's also got spices. But what I'm missing is the booze, as I keep saying to my colleagues. There's no booze in this one. So the plum pudding started life as a pottage, and was probably like a broth, which contained raisins, dried fruit, spices and wine, and it was thickened with breadcrumbs and ground almonds, and it wasn't dissimilar to what they would have eaten with regards to a mince pie. This plum pottage would be served at the start of the meal or as part of the meal. It wasn't served as a pudding or as a sweet. It's not until the 17th century that the pottage takes on a more solid appearance, and then it's more like a porridge, and they stuff it sometimes inside a skin, which they then slice and place under the meat. So it's still not a dessert. During the 18th century, the plum porridge becomes more associated with Christmas, but it's the Victorians. It's the Victorians again that bring it to prominence as the pudding to have at the end of the Christmas meal. And again, I suppose we could in part say this is to do with Charles Dickens, because we have that image of Mrs. Cratchit bringing a rounded pudding, because it would have been formed into a ball, it would have been steamed or cooked within a cloth, a rounded ball within a cloth, and it's described by Charles Dickens as looking like a spotted cannonball with a sprig of holly in the top and flaming with brandy. The Victorians, they liked their Christmas, but they didn't like all the rowdy frolicking that would have gone alongside it. So what they tried to do is make the festive time a little more sedate, and they tried to bring the family in, and they do that by bringing in something called Stir Up Sunday, which is the 5th Sunday before Christmas, where they get together, they mix the pudding, they stir the pudding from east to west, apparently to signify the journey of the three kings round to Jesus. And as they do it, it's supposed to bring them good luck. And that brings me in mind of, in my family, we have, well, we didn't ever call it stir up, but it was a stir up Friday night. When we would stir the pudding, we stir the pudding 3 times and we have a wish, and I suspect that a lot of people still do that, so that may be where that comes from. Inside the pudding, remember the trinkets that I mentioned for 12th night? So inside the pudding are trinkets. A silver coin was said to mean that there was good fortune coming your way in the year. A silver ring that you may well be getting married at some point within the future, near future. But if you found the thimble, then that was certain spinsterhood for you. The plum pudding, the Christmas pudding, it does really come to epitomise Christmas. Love it or hate it, it tends to be the finale to every Christmas meal. But if it wasn't eaten up on the day, then people could add it to a mixture and make it into an Eccles cake. Some people would add it to a custard and eat it as a sort of a custardy pudding, and then some people would slice it and fry it, which takes us right back to the beginning when we saw them doing the same and putting it under the meat all those years before. So moving on, we're now moving to the Christmas tree. The Christmas tree we think of as being a very Victorian invention, and it is in this country certainly. But the Victorians didn't actually invent it within itself. It's said to come from Estonia via Latvia via Germany, where they think what happened in the beginning was that trees would be decorated with paper flowers and apples. So they would decorate at the tree, and then at some point in time they would add lighted candles to the tree. And Martin Luther was supposedly said to add lighted candles to a Christmas tree, and then the tree would be brought inside. And if you think about it, our Christmas lights that we put on it are probably a reflection of those early candles. In Britain, in England, we were still putting in the greenery up until really Victoria. Now Victoria would have been familiar with the Christmas tree because her relation, who was George III's German-born wife, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, would place a Christmas tree in the house each year, and Victoria would undoubtedly have seen that as a child. So she then went on to put a Christmas tree in her house. But Albert, obviously coming across and living with Victoria, they would always have a Christmas tree. And once people had got wind of that, then people aspire to it. So they get the middle classes that all start to bring in Christmas trees, and that's where our tradition really formed. Now our document sort of really does, it's around the mid-19th century, so it's probably quite early on that this particular family is putting a Christmas tree into their house. And we can see, if you can read it, that they talk about the tree and decorating it with fruit, etc. So, you know, this lovely idea, and we think this letter dates to about the mid-19th century, and it's written by Louisa Shirley. So, moving on again, let's move on from Christmas trees and move to Christmas giving, I suppose, is what I should call this really. But this is more about what happens to the tenants and the poor and the giving at Christmas. So if we look through Victorian eyes, the Victorians, they're a strange mix in many ways. They are very philanthropic, so they look to looking after their poor in many ways and trying to reform things like the prison system and all the rest of it. But they are also the people that will utilise the workhouse to its greatest form, really. So there is that sort of that distinction. But the Victorians are looking back and thinking about what has changed at Christmas time. They like the idea of tenants providing a great feast for, the landlords providing a great feast for their tenants at Christmas. And that was true. Now we have a volume, unfortunately, which we can't show you today, but we do have a volume that sometimes resides here at the record office that shows a lady of a large household in her accounts accounting for the feast that she's going to provide for the tenants of her husband during Christmas. So we know that that happened, and it dates to about the 1740s. Previously to that, Elizabeth I was very keen that her courtiers did not remain in London through the festive period, but that actually they returned home in order that they could provide the feast to their tenants. And that's partly for Elizabeth to do with the fact that she wanted a merry England. She wanted to make sure that people had something to look forward to. And if they had something to look forward to, and if they were given this great feast and they felt appreciated, that it would keep social order running smoothly, that there wouldn't be any uprisings because people would be happy. So she does actually say you must go home at Christmas. The document that we have today is it's from the Featherstone Dilk collection, and it's a list of names of the heads of families who are receipt of Christmas charity in 1816. And I think that's the other thing to say. If you were poor, or if you were a tenant and perhaps weren't particularly well off, you could look forward to a feast at Christmas. Christmas time was something that you would look forward to because there might be a little bit of relief. You might get some fuel, you might get some food that you wouldn't ordinarily have. You might be doled out money on Boxing Day, as we mentioned earlier. as I suspect, as people moved from rural areas into the cities and towns because of the industrialisation during the industrial revolution, and also because of the decline of the manor, there would be fewer people that would attend these great feasts that were laid on by tenants and by the lords of the manor. And by the way, I don't think it was just one way. I think sometimes tenants were expected to take a hen or a gift of the lord as well, so that sort of was quite a nice reciprocal arrangement. But these dinners seem to have died out, and that has happened, I suspect, until now. But I think it does still survive in a form. I remember years ago as a child in the 1970s that my father worked for a factory, and every Christmas all the children would be invited to a great Christmas party where there would be food and a party, and we would see a pantomime, and then at the end of the evening we would all be given a gift by Father Christmas. And to me that kind of smacks of that old tradition of giving to, you know, the people that you are responsible for. That isn't to say that people wouldn't fall through the cracks. I think in an industrialised area where poor people would have existed everywhere, it would be difficult to pick up on everybody, and it would be difficult for the parish to provide everybody with what they needed. Our other document relates to a party for retired workers for the English Electric Williams works. And again, it seems to me that this is perhaps where the Christmas dinner that was provided for workers, they're not agricultural workers, they're industrial workers, but maybe it evolved into that. I don't know, it's a thought. So actually, to go over then to gift giving, you'll see that we've got some lovely, you'll see an image of a Christmas catalogue. We've got some lovely Christmas catalogues, and the image that I'm looking at the moment is Meccano and Hornby trains. This is a 1930s catalogue, Leicester's Christmas catalogue of 1936. Gift giving. Well, Christmas traditionally, medieval and Tudors, wouldn't have gift giving for everybody. It wouldn't be something that everybody would do, unless I suppose you thought of it as being the dolls that were given out or the meal that was given to you. It would be only the most upper classes that would give a gift, and it would often be a political gift to the king. So there's a lovely document again that I saw on TV the other night of a list of gifts that were given to Henry VIII, and the gifts, how he thought of the gift would be how you would be treated in the future. So, you know, you had to be very careful about what you chose for Henry VIII. So Anne apparently gave him a boar spear because he liked hunting. So that meant she was well up in his favour, as we already know. He didn't give a gift because he would give a gift in return. He refused the gift of Catherine of Aragon that year, and he didn't give a gift to Catherine of Aragon either. So that shows you that she was totally out of favour. You know, gift giving as such wouldn't have happened until sort of much later. I suppose when we first start to see it, well, we know nowadays that gift giving is what Christmas unfortunately can be about for many. So I wanted to show you a few images of some gifts that. Okay. Actually, it is the 20th century when people suddenly start to direct their marketing at children so that there would be gift giving. So we're going to move on to our final image and final two images, and these are a more intimate look at Christmas. So the first, it's a letter of 1759, a lovely letter. He's obviously away from home, and he writes it's a letter to Charles Mordaunt, I should say, from his son, and the son writes to Charles Mordaunt and he says that he's hoping to be at Walton before your Christmas fireside is broke up, which is lovely. It's a lovely image of family coming together before a warm fire at Christmas time. However, there is the flip side of Christmas, and I think that this is important to mention, particularly because of the year that we've all had, where people may have lost loved ones, or they might find themselves in a financially precarious position, or perhaps some find themselves isolated. So if people are in such a position, you know, there is perhaps a more acute sense of sadness. The final document is that of John Compton, who writes to the Reverend Edward Wills in Warwickshire, dated 1786, and he writes to say really that he's missed 2 meetings with his friends because his father has recently died. So it's a most melancholy Christmas at his brother's household because his brother is seriously ill and is being looked after by another brother. And actually we know that the brother that is seriously ill will unfortunately die. So Christmas isn't always the easiest of times for anybody. However, this gentleman obviously reaches out because he says, I'm going to meet up with you hopefully the following year. And I think that's the important message that maybe we ought to take away from this year, that we can reach out, we can talk to people on the telephone, we can talk to them through FaceTiming them, and we can reach out to organisations that will help us through those difficult times. So perhaps we are in a slightly more fortunate position, even though we are going through ourselves a most difficult time. So I've come to the end of the 12 documents of Christmas. I hope that you've enjoyed it. I'm turning now in trepidation to Sharon to see if we've received any questions and to see also if I can answer any of your questions. Please feel free to send them again via our website if you don't want to do it online now, because we will do our best to answer the questions. And again, as I say, visit the Our Warwickshire website because it's really, it's a lovely thing to look at and see other people's experiences.
So we've had one question during the talk. Lovely to hear about the interaction between carols and wassailing. Do you know much about the history of the interaction between house-to-house wassailing and the orchard wassails?
I have heard of the orchard wassails where they would wassail, yes, to the orchard, and I'm presuming that that's something that goes way back, but I don't know very much more than that. So I've heard of it, but I don't know much more than that, is my answer.
And the next is not so much a question as a comment, saying thank you for the last document. Very pertinent for these times.
Ah, yes. Well, that's why we wanted to put it last. We wanted to sort of show you how archives can really reflect the feelings even of the present, and that people experience similar things to what we all experience today. So yes, that's what that was the plan, I have to say, for today.
Yeah.
So I think if we've answered the questions.
Has any of the recipes from the documents been attempted?
Yes. Yes. Some with great success, some with less.
It's always interesting to taste the difference between what we expect and what is in the recipes.
Yes, that's very true. And I often wonder, they tended to like things like rose water, which a lot of people don't like because they say it tastes like soap. I don't mind it actually, but I've also read that you're not supposed to taste it, so I do wonder whether we're putting exactly. It's supposed to smell of it, but not necessarily I've been told to taste of it.
It tastes like soap.
But the taste has definitely changed. The palate has definitely changed as time has gone on. There really was a sense of sweet and savoury together. That was not an issue. And so very often what you find you're eating is something that we would probably think is almost like a sweet, hence mince pies. You know, we don't put meat in them anymore, but years ago it's quite acceptable to put what we would consider sweet with what we would also consider as being savoury. Whether there's a practical reason for that, because it disguises some taste that we perhaps might not want to if the meat was particularly great, or whether it's just that that's what they liked, I don't know. So.
Well, the recipe on our Warwickshire for mince pies that you mentioned, that does involve tripe and ox tongue.
Yes.
And there was a difference between the two.
Tripe and ox tongue mince pies.
There's one for the Christmas.
I think I'll give that one a miss and stick with those.
Yeah, so we've got no more questions now.
Okay, so I think then all that remains for me to say is that we hope that you've enjoyed the last hour or so, and it just remains for Sharon and I and Carolyn on behalf of Warwickshire County Record Office to wish you all a Christmas of great hope for next year, and to thank you for joining us.